Mr. Barnett Rubin, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Afghanistan is in a critical situation: political fragmentation, war, no clear landscape for intra-Afghan negotiations, and on the top of that, coronavirus. Where we are heading?
Well, thank you for having me on. First, I wanted to appear wearing this mask because I have to wear this now whenever I go out of my apartment. And I wanted your viewers to understand that though the situation is, of course, much worse in Afghanistan, the situation is also very bad here in the United States. And they should take that into account in thinking about the future of Afghanistan. Because remember what happened in 1991 and 1992. What happened, of course, with the fall of Najibullah and the outbreak of the Civil War was partly due to events in Afghanistan. But what really set it off was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fact that the government did not stop receiving foreign aid. And that is what really set off the collapse. And I think there's a real danger that the events both in Afghanistan and the United States might lead to something like that in Afghanistan today, so that the threat that Secretary of State Pompeo made of withdrawing $1 billion worth of aid this year, $1 billion next year, is extremely serious, because that's, and he's just saying that because of the political situation between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. But even if they manage to resolve that, I'm not at all confident that the aid would continue at the same level, because people should understand what the situation is here.
But the U.S. has said, Secretary Pompeo and other officials said that if the political leaders, Abdullah and Ghani, can compromise and make a united government and a united team for the negotiations, the aid may, they can reverse their decision about the aid.
Certainly, they may reverse their decision about the aid for now, but bear in mind that what is happening economically in the United States. Our economy is going to decline by about 25% this quarter. My wife is a healthcare worker. Every day she comes to me and tells me that her patients are losing their jobs. The U.S. Congress is about to allocate $2 trillion as just the start of a plan to try to save the American economy. That's 10% of the entire economy of the United States. And that's just in the first month or two of what is. So the United States is going to be entirely focused on trying to save its own economy and trying to save tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from dying. So even if President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah make an agreement and Secretary Pompeo restores that aid right now, I think there's still a very good chance that because of what's happening in the United States.
So you don't think that with the consequences of the pandemic in the U.S., Washington will remain committed to Afghanistan financially?
I think it's quite unlikely because of with the consequences of the pandemic here. Of course, it won't happen immediately because money for this year is already in the pipeline, as we say, being sent. But when it comes to try to allocate money for next year, I'm sure that the Congress will say, what we're spending, we need to spend trillions of dollars just to save our own lives. We're not going to send billions of dollars to Afghanistan where they're fighting with each other. And in addition to that, bear in mind what your own Minister of Public Health said the other day. Your own Minister of Public Health said that millions and millions of people in Afghanistan are going to be infected by the virus, that at least over 100,000 people will die of the pandemic in Afghanistan. And of course, you don't have the health care to deal with it. Now, what is going to happen to our troops if that takes place? Is the United States going to be willing to keep its troops stationed in Afghanistan while they're in the middle of a pandemic like that, where they can't get proper medical care.
Do you think they will?
So I very much doubt it, and they might need those troops at home for humanitarian relief purposes. So I don't know, but I want to emphasize that, unfortunately, because Afghanistan is so dependent on the outside world, what happens in Afghanistan is not just dependent on Afghanistan or on how the outside world reacts to Afghanistan. The Soviet Union did not break up because of Afghanistan. It broke up for reasons that had nothing to do with Afghanistan. But when it broke up, it had a tremendous effect on Afghanistan. The United States is not suffering from the coronavirus because of Afghanistan, but with what is going to happen to our economy and to our people, I think it'll be much less likely that we will devote resources to helping any foreign country. I certainly, some of us are opposed to that, and we think that nonetheless we should continue to do that. It's not very much compared to how much we'll need to spend, but frankly, I'm not very confident that we would succeed in that. So I think, so that's why my message to Afghans, in particular to your political leaders, is that you cannot go planning as if business is going to continue as usual. You are possibly on the brink of something like 1991 or 1992, not because of the peace agreement, not because of troop withdrawal, but because as a result of the political deadlock and the reaction of the United States, and because of the result of the pandemic in the United States and what it's doing to our economy, that could lead to a severe cutback in U.S. assistance to Afghanistan in a way that is not planned or coordinated with any peace agreement.
What will happen? Do you think that Afghanistan can sustain such big problems?
I don't know, but what I'm saying is that what its leaders need right now is really pretty much to forget about their political demands. Everybody, this is my very naive position as someone who's not a political leader, and I know I don't mean to criticize any of them. I know them all as individuals, but and I'm sure they're all trying to do the best for their country. But right now, whether you have a prime minister or not a prime minister, whether you have 40% or 50% of the appointments, is not really very important when hundreds of thousands of people might be on the verge of dying.
But right now, the problem between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah is really on the sharing of the government. So are you sure that they really want peace for Afghanistan and development?
Well, my point is that there won't be any power left to share if the United States pulls out its aid and the government collapses, which won't happen immediately, but it's a realistic possibility. And not only, even if they agree, it's a realistic possibility because of what is happening to the economy here in the United States. So that's why I'm saying and it's not just the leaders in Afghanistan. Leaders all over the world are not acting with an appropriate sense of urgency. Our leaders in the United States are not acting with an appropriate sense of urgency. What they say about this type of epidemic is, if you really want to prevent it, you have to do things that look like there are tremendous overreactions, much too much, really early. And in the same way, if they want to prevent the collapse of the government and more violence and so on, they have to make concessions right now that seem maybe huge and unjustified, but it might be the only way that they can prevent something much, much worse.
So they don't have any other option other than to compromise and get united?
I don't think so. And then they also have to, both they and the Taliban similarly, have to compromise, because nobody's going to be able to win this war with 100,000 people dying of a plague. It's ridiculous. What they need to stop all fighting immediately. And the prisons are very dangerous situations because people are overcrowded there. The disease will spread, and the idea, and of course, not everybody who's in prison is a Talib, but even so, once it starts spreading in the prisons, it leaves the prisons because people come from outside prisons to work in the prisons. And prisons are well known in every country. They are a big center of spreading of disease. Like in Iran, for instance, which is a big center of this pandemic now, they have released 85,000 people from jail, from prison, just for public health reasons. In the United States now, in different localities, we are considering releasing prisoners. We should be doing it much more quickly because the prisons are very dangerous. So the prisons in Afghanistan are dangerous, not only for the prisoners, but for the entire country, because they're breeding grounds for the epidemic, for the pandemic.
You support the prisoner release, the government releasing the prisoners of the Taliban. But what if they return to the battlefield?
Well, I support also the Taliban releasing the prisoners of their prisoners as well. As I said, the number of people who will die in the pandemic is much greater than the number of people who will be killed by war or terrorism. So that's what people see. People don't see it because it's in the future. But in fact, the most important thing now by far is preventing the spread of this pandemic. That means you need to get a ceasefire as quickly as possible, cooperation among all sides of the war, because the danger from the pandemic is much bigger than the danger of war or terrorism. Now, you don't see it yet, but you will see it when it is too late to do anything about it.
Are you expecting that the pandemic will force the fighters in Afghanistan to end fighting naturally because of the coronavirus?
No, it might not end it violent. It might not force them to end fighting. It might make them fight more because they'll be fighting for scarce resources. That would be a really terrible situation. It really depends on their leadership. Their leaders have to be more foresighted now on all sides. And the Taliban are not showing that kind of leadership. They're being extremely stubborn and extremist as always. The government and the opposition, Dr. Abdullah, are stuck in their positions, and everyone is going on as if they have time to pursue these conflicts. But I'm afraid that you don't have that time, because hundreds of thousands of people are going to die of the disease, and you'll be wasting your time and energy killing just a few of each other over things that are much smaller.
If we put the pandemic aside, do you think that cutting aid is a good way to solve political problems and disputes in Afghanistan?
Generally speaking, I don't think so. But it could be. It also needs some kind of encouragement. Actually, I was just discussing this, interestingly enough, with a friend of mine in the Iranian government. Of course, I cannot mention who he is, but we were talking on social media. And he was saying that perhaps the combination of pressure from the United States and encouragement from Iran would help bring those two sides together. But again, that's another huge problem because, the United States sanctions on Iran are damaging Iran. And the United States and Iran really need to cooperate to help these political leaders reach agreement right now. And because of the conflict between those two countries, we're unable to do that. So that is also aggravating the situation in Afghanistan.
You mentioned about Iran's recent stance. Do you think that it shows that Iran doesn't want a withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Afghanistan for right now?
Iran's position about that is always very unclear. They always say they want the troop. On the one hand, they say they want the troops to withdraw. On the other hand, they accuse the United States of abandoning Afghanistan to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the so-called Islamic Emirate of the Taliban. But right now, of course, the United States Iran believes that the United States government is intent on overthrowing the government in Iran. So they just want the United States to leave Afghanistan. But unfortunately, again, this is another case where this is a conflict which is, it's going on for 40 years and it's very deeply felt on both sides and there are many issues and so on. But meanwhile, both the United States and Iran are facing a pandemic in which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to be killed, and Afghanistan is caught between them. So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said yesterday he's called on everyone in the world to observe a truce, a humanitarian ceasefire, and focus on fighting this disease. He called for the lifting of sanctions and so on. So again, people maybe they feel more afraid after the terrible thing that happened in Kabul today, the attack on the Sikh temple, the gurudwara, the Dharmasala, by ISIS or by some other extremists. After that, of course, that's something that people are very frightened of. It's horrible. It's a war crime. But at this, so it's more immediate. But
ISIS claimed the responsibility for this attack, but some of the experts don't believe this. They say some groups like Ghani network, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and other Pakistani-based militants could be behind this attack. What do you think?
I saw those reports. I don't have any independent sources of information, so I'm not going to give any opinion. The main thing I think is that this was a terrible war crime. It killed 25 people, but you have something coming that's going to kill over 100,000 people very quickly.
But what's the benefit of U.S. Taliban deal if these kind of attacks continue?
The benefit of U.S. Taliban deal will be that we can get a ceasefire, and if the U.S. Taliban and the Afghan government can work together, it will be much more effective in suppressing ISIS. At the moment, while they're distracted in fighting each other and in other matters, they're much less effective.
Do you think that the Taliban are going to make pressure on Afghan government by increasing their attacks to secure their prisoners' release?
I certainly hope not, because that will not, one, it's counterproductive because of the pandemic, and second, it won't work. The fact is, if they try to put more pressure on the Afghan government, it will make the Afghan government more stubborn, in the same way that putting more pressure on the Taliban right now makes the Taliban more stubborn. I think both sides have to openly say that the priority right now is the pandemic. And I think, above all, I should add, they can't do this by themselves. They need to have a mediator who can go and make those proposals to them. I know in the past the government hasn't wanted a mediator. Others have not wanted a mediator because they wanted to be in control of the negotiations themselves. But right now, because there is this huge other interest, which is stopping the pandemic, I think you need a figure appointed maybe by the UN Secretary General or something like that to represent that common interest that Afghans have over their tremendous political divisions and hatreds, which is this, fighting against this virus, which does not respect any of those political divisions, hatreds, ethnic, sectarian distinctions. It attacks everyone equally, and they have to fight back against it together.
But the pandemic will end finally. What will remain if the Afghan leaders cannot compromise and the intra-Afghan negotiations cannot succeed?
Well, I don't want to make predictions, but after all, remember that the Afghan state is almost entirely dependent on foreign aid. The Afghan government depends more on foreign assistance now than it did under Najibullah. Okay? And at the time of Najibullah could just print money. He brought big containers of 10,000 Afghani notes from Russia and distributed them to people. The current government cannot do that because they have an independent central bank. And that's why you don't have tremendous inflation and inflate right now. But in the future, if the aid is withdrawn, then this government is even more vulnerable than Najibullah government was. Well, you know what happened after that. Maybe you don't remember it. You might be too young. But, certainly many people in Afghanistan remember it. And this could be the same, or it could be worse. And it would be magnified by the pandemic taking place at the same time.
Do you think that the Taliban are happy with the political fragmentation in Kabul?
You know, they have different attitudes. I suppose some of them who are very short-sighted might think that it's good for them because they will be able to take over. But the fact is, if the government fragments, then they won't have anyone to make peace with. They won't be able to reach some kind of agreement, and there won't be any. And they need the resources of the government very badly because the government has the resources of healthcare and so on, and the healthcare systems. Look, even in areas controlled by the Taliban in Afghanistan today, they still allow the government health facilities to operate to some extent because they don't have those resources themselves. You know, if the government collapses and doesn't have any aid, then the Taliban will lose their health facilities too. So they should not be so short-sighted as to think that.
So you don't expect the Taliban to try to take over the country?
I don't know what to expect because they might try to take over just as you know, but if they did try to take over, there would be nothing left for them to take over. They wouldn't, you know, so I know that some of them are wise enough to understand that. Some of them may not be, you know, and if, you know, often a war like this starts not because anyone wants it, but because they see no alternative, because no one leads them out of it. There is really a vacuum of leadership now of people who can explain to the people clearly how big the danger is and why they have to do things that they otherwise would resist.
Is there the possibility or the risk of a civil war, an intensified civil war, if the Taliban try to take over the country?
Of course there is, yeah. Not just civil war, but the neighbors will become involved as well because because they don't want the Taliban to take over the country. Anyone who tries to take over the country by himself is in danger of starting a civil war because right now everyone needs to cooperate against this much bigger enemy, which is the pandemic.
For now, how Afghanistan can fight the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, first of all, everyone should stop fighting and stay at home as much as possible. Like I am staying in my apartment. I am not leaving. Now, everyone cannot do that, but everyone who can should do that. Stock up on and wash your hands constantly every few minutes or every hour or so. I wash my hands. When I go outside, I wear a mask. I'm illustrating this to you here. I put on gloves. And you need to focus everything on, and you don't have medical equipment. China is starting to send medical equipment to Afghanistan. That's very good. But how are you going to distribute it throughout the country?
Actually, they sent it to many countries, including US, in Iran also.
Yes, that's right. And I wish the United States were able to do that, but unfortunately, we don't have enough equipment for ourselves right now. We have great shortages. You know, in order to, of course, China can send those things to Kabul, but how are you going to distribute them to people in the rest of the country? Maybe they can fly them to Herat, where there's the greatest need right now. But still, you need to distribute it to the rest of the country. And that means there's a huge, absolute need for a ceasefire, for security, for cooperation among all sides to save hundreds of thousands of people.
So do you think that the pandemic and also cutting off the aid finally force Afghan leaders to compromise?
I won't try to predict anything. I'm just saying that if they if they don't find a way to compromise, the results will be very disastrous.
Mr. Barnett Rubin, an American expert of Afghanistan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. And good luck to Afghanistan.
Thank you.